Welcome back to Heavier Than Heaven by Charles L. Cross. R, not L. Read to you by Bradley Dahlberg. 2024. Up to Chapter 5. The Will of Instinct. Aberdeen, Washington, April 1984 through September 1986. So have you graduated high school now? It was a hell of a last chapter about sexual conquest. It amazes me, the will of instinct. Lyrics from Polly, 1990. Early that Monday morning, Kurt walked the streets of Aberdeen, sniffing her sex on his fingers. For a person who was obsessed with the smell, it was an intoxicating experience. To relieve the act, all he needed to do was rub his fingers on his own crotch, and when he sniffed them, her scent was still there. Already his mind was forgetting the fact that his sexual initiation was a near catastrophe, and instead was turning into a triumph in his memory. The actual circumstances didn't matter, crummy sex or not. He was no longer a virgin, and being a romantic at heart, he had already assumed his first sexual encounter was the beginning of many pleasant romps with this girl, and that the start of his adult sexual experience, a balm that he could count on like beer or pot to help him escape his lot. On a walk toward Weatherwax, he stole a flower from the yard. Jackie saw Kurt sheepishly heading toward the smoker's shack outside the high school, with this one red rose in his hand, and she thought it was for her, but Kurt delivered it to the girl that he had slept with, who was unimpressed. What Kurt failed to understand was that it was Jackie who had the crush on him, and the other girl, in the contrast, was embarrassed by her indiscretion, and further embarrassed by the flower. It was a painful lesson, and for someone so sensitive as Kurt, and further confused his need for love and his complications of adult sexuality. Ribbit. Sticky pages. Up to 58. Charles R. Cross. Big Jew on the lawn. After school, there was more immediate concerns, the first being in the place to live. Buzz drove with him to get his stuff. As Kurt had correctly surmised, this tiff with his mother was indifferent from the others, and they'd arrived to her for still in the rage. His mom was just freaking out the entire time, telling him what a total fucking loser he was, Osborne recalled. He just kept saying, "Okay, Mom, okay." She made it clear she didn't even want him in the house. As he gathered his precious guitar and amp and his clothes in a series of hefty bags, Kurt began his final emotional physical flight from his family, and there had been other flights. And retreating as a habit began soon after the divorce, but most of these moves were his. This time it was powerless and very real fear over how he might care for himself. He was 17 years old, a junior in high school, but failing most of his classes, and he had never had a job and had no money, and all of his stuff in 4 hefty bags. He was sure he was leaving, but he had no idea where he was going. If the divorce had been his first betrayal and his father's remarriage the second, and the abandonment was already significant, Wendy was done with him. She complained to her sisters and that she didn't know what to do with Kurt anymore. Their battles were exacerbating her conflicts with Pat, and she was planning to marry, and she could ill afford the relationship, and only for the economic reasons Kurt felt perhaps correctly that yet again one of his parents was choosing a new partner over him. This was marginalization that would stick with him. Combined with an earlier emotional wounds and experience of being kicked out would be something that would return repeatedly, never able to completely free himself from the trauma, and it would be a lie that there would be just under the surface, a pain that would be enshrouded by the rest of his life, but a fear of scarcity. There would never be enough money and enough attention, or the most important, enough love, because he knew exactly how quickly it could all vanish. 7 years later, as he would write a song about this personal period, something in the way, the something was then explained by the oblique lyrics, but there's a little doubt that he was the one that was in the way. The song implies that the singer is living under the bridge, and when asked to clarify, Kurt always told the story of getting kicked out of the house, dropping out of school, and living under the Yonge Street Bridge. It would eventually become the touchstone of his cultural biography and one of his single or most powerful pieces of myth-making, and the one piece of Kurt's history certain to appear in any one paragraph description of his life. This kid was so unwanted, he lived under a bridge, and it was a potent and dark image. It made all the more resonant when Nirvana became famous and the pictures began to appear in the magazines of the underside of the Yonge Street Bridge. Its rank, fatigued nature apparent, and even in photographs it looked something like a troll would live under, not a child. The bridge was only 2 blocks from his mother's house in a distance, as Kurt told it, no amount of life could cross. The living under the bridge story, however, was just like the Guns for Guitars story. It was greatly embellished in the Kurt telling. He never lived under that bridge, insisted Chris Novoselic, who met Kurt in high school that year. He hung out there. You couldn't live under the muddy banks with the tides coming up and down. That was his own revisionism. His sister echoed the same belief. He did not live underneath that bridge. It was a hangout where the neighborhood kids would go and smoke pot, but that's all. And if Kurt ever spent a single night underneath the Aberdeen Bridge, locals argue it would have been the 16th Street Bridge, a much bigger span, a half-mile, stretching over a small canyon, favored by the Aberdeen's homeless and whiner. A few whiners could survive an Aberdeen spring outdoors, where the weather is something just short of daily monsoon. There is a significance, though. The bridge story is only because Kurt emphatically told the tale so many times. At a point, he must have begun to believe it himself. The true tale of where he spent most of his days and nights during this period is more poignant than even Kurt's renditions of the events. His journeys began at Dale Crover's porch, and when he slept in a cardboard refrigerator box, curled up like a kitten when a welcome ran out there. His integrity and his willingness did not fail him. There were so many old apartment buildings in Aberdeen, and with the central heating in the hallways, this is where he could retreat most nights, and he could sneak late and find a wide hallway, unscrew the overhead light, spread out a bedroll, and go to sleep. And make sure to get up before the residents began their day. It was as if life summoned Best by the line he'd write a few years later in a song. It amazes me, the will of instinct. His instinctual survival skills served him well, and his will was strong. When all else failed, Kurt and another kid named Paul White would walk up a hill to Grays Harbor Community Hospital, and they would sleep in the waiting room. Kurt was the more daring of the two, or maybe the two more desperate, and would brazenly go through the hospital cafeteria line and charge food to made-up room numbers. And there was a television in the waiting room, and we could watch all day, remembered White. People always thought that we were waiting for a patient who was ill or dying, and they'd never question you when it was concerned that. This was the real story behind the emotional truth captured in Something in the Way, and perhaps the greatest irony in his life is that Kurt ended up back to where he begun, back in a hospital with a territorial view of the harbor, back to where he was born 17 years previously and where he was sleeping in the waiting room, like a fugitive sneaking rolls at the cafeteria and pretending to look like a bereaved relative of someone who was ill, but only to have the illness and real be loneliness he felt in his heart. After about 4 months of living on the street, Kurt finally returned to live with his father, and it wasn't easy that he'd even considered moving back in with the parent. Shows his level of desperation. Don and Jenny heard that Kurt was homeless and found him sleeping on an old sofa in a garage just across the alley from Wendy's house. He was very angry at everybody at the time, and he wanted everybody to think that nobody would take him, and it pretty much was true. Jenny remembered. Back in Monsanto, Kurt returned to his basement room in the Fleet Street house. His authority struggles with his father escalated, and it was as if time away from Don only made his resolve stronger. All the parties knew Kurt's presence wasn't permanent arrangement, and they had mutually outgrown their need and want for each other. Kurt's guitar made life tolerable, and he practiced for hours, and his friends and family began to notice that he was becoming skilled at playing it. He could play a song after listening to it just once, anything from an Air Supply to John Cougar Mellencamp, recalled his stepbrother James. The family rented the Spinal Tap, and Kurt and James watched it 5 times in a row and soon began to recite the dialogue from the film and play the band's songs. While Kurt was back at Don's and Jenny's, There was yet another suicide in the family. Kenneth Cobain, Leland's only remaining brother, grew despondent over the death of his wife, shot himself in the forehead with a .22 caliber pistol. The loss was almost too much for Leland to bear, and the cumulative effect of the tragic death of the father of his son Michael and his 3 other brothers tempered with the bluster with a severe melancholy. If you consider Ernest's death a suicide by alcohol, all 3 of Leland's brothers had died by their own hand, 2 by shooting themselves. Bullshit. Bullshit if I ever read it. Don't believe it for a second. Don't be that fucking stupid. Fucking pushing the suicide narrative makes me sick. Kurt wasn't close to these useless, but their mouthful pals over the house. It seemed as if the family had cursed on all fronts. His stepmother made efforts to find Kurt a job on the lawn work, and since that was the only work that could be found in Monty other than logging, Kurt mowed a few lawns but quickly became bored with it. He looked in the want ads once or twice, and that wasn't too many jobs in Montesano, the county's biggest economic enterprise. The Satsop nuclear power plant had gone a bust before fully being constructed, leaving an unemployment at 15%, twice as high as the rest of the state. Things came to a head when Don announced as if Kurt was going to go to school or work. He had to join the service. The next night, Don invited a Navy recruiter to talk to his son. Instead of a strong, willful man who later became in his life, must have grabbed the Navy man by his collar and thrown him headfirst out the door, the recruiter found a sad and broken boy. Kurt, to everyone's surprise, listened to the pitch. At the end of the evening, much of his father's relief, Kurt said that he considered it. To Kurt, the service sounded like a hell, but it was the hell of a different zip code. Kurt told Jesse Reed that at least the Navy could get you 3 hots and a cot. To a kid who had been living in the street and sleeping in a hospital waiting room, the security and shelter of food without a parental price to pay appeared tempting, but when Don tried to convince him to let the recruiter return the next night, Kurt said forget it. Desperate for something, he found religion, and he and Jesse began inseparable of 1984 and extended to going to church together. Jesse's parents, Ethel and Dave Reed, were both born-again Christians, and the family went to the Central Park Baptist Church, halfway between Monty and Aberdeen, and Kurt began to attend Sunday service regularly, even made appearances at Wednesday night Christian youth group. He was baptized in the church that October, and though none of his family members were present, Jesse even remembered Kurt was going through a born-again conversion experience. One night we were walking over to the Chehalis River Bridge, and he stopped and said he accepted Jesus Christ into his life, and he asked God to come into his life. And I remembered him distinctly talking about the revelations and the calmness that everybody talks about when they accept Christ. In that next couple of weeks, Kurt displayed the tone of evangelism born-again Christian. He began to chastise Jesse for smoking pot and disregarding the Bible and being a poor Christian. Kurt's religious conversion coincided with one of his many short sober periods. His history with drugs and alcohol would always consist of a binge followed by a fast. He wrote a letter to his Aunt Marie that month exposing his views on marijuana. I just got done watching Reefer Madness on MTV. It was made in the 30s, and if people had one toke at the devil drug, marijuana, they were spaced out big time and killed each other, had affairs, and ran over innocent victims in cars. They sent this teenager who looked like a beaver on a murder ramp. Wow. What more excitement than that I can handle? It was all over a big exaggeration, and I accept the whole idea behind it. Pot sucks. I know from a personal experience, because for a while there I was almost as lethargic and a moody piece of cheese. I think that was a big problem with my mom and I. I was as lethargic as a moldy piece of cheese. Yet almost as soon as he mailed the letter and found himself settling into the pattern of church life, Kurt disregarded his faith as a pair of pants he'd overgrown. He was hungry for it, Jesse said. But it was a transitionary moment out of fear. When fear subsided, Kurt smoked pot again. He attended the Central Park Baptist only for another 3 months, but his talk to Jesse, he remembered he was moving against God, and after that he was on an anti-God thing. Jesse's parents had grown attached to Kurt, and since he was there at the house so often, they suggested he move in, and they lived in the North River, a rural area 14 miles outside of Aberdeen. At the time, two boys seemed to provide something to each other that was missing in their individual lives. The Reeds discussed the possibility of Kurt moving into the North River, and Wendy and Don and Jenny all agreed with it and thought it was worth a try. Wendy told the Reeds that she was at her wit's end, and to the point echoed by Don and Jenny, and Dave Reed came to us, recalled Jenny, and said that he thought he could do something for him. And they were a religious family, and Dave felt that he could discipline him with no one else could. We really loved Kurt, explained Ethel Reed. He was such a sweet kid. He was just seemed lost. And in September, Kurt packed his belongings, and once again, he had a duffel bag and moved to the North River. The Reeds lived in a 4,000 square foot home, and the boys had the run of the huge upstairs. Perhaps the best thing about the house is that it was remote, and that they could crank up their electric guitars as loud as they wanted, and they would play all day. Though the Reeds was a Christian youth counselor, he resembled Ned Flanders from The Simpsons with his short hair and mustache, and he wasn't a square. Reed had been playing rock and roll for 20 years, and he had been in the Beachcombers with Kurt's Uncle Chuck, so he was known to the family. The house was stocked up with amps and guitars and albums, and the Reeds were also less strict than Don. They let Kurt travel to Seattle with Buzz and Lucan to see the seminal punk band Black Flag, and the Rocket called the show in the second best 1984. But to Kurt, it wasn't the second only to the Melvins parking lot show. It was in every interview he did later in life. He claimed that this was the first concert he ever saw. It was here at the Reeds' house where Kurt first jammed with Chris Novoselic. Novoselic was 2 years older than Kurt, and he was impossible to miss around Grace Harbor. At 6'7", he resembled a young Abraham Lincoln. Chris was a Croatian heritage and came from a family marked by divorce and could compete against Kurt for dysfunction. Chris had also been known as Chris. In Aberdeen, he changed the spelling of his name to the original Croatian birth name in 1992. Kurt had met Chris in high school and at a Melvin's practice space, but their lives had also intersected in one space or another, and neither of them would ever mention again the Central Park Baptist Church. Chris had been attending the church, but even as the elders like Mr. Reed knew, he was there just for the girls. Jesse invited Chris to his house one afternoon, and the three jammed. Chris played guitar, and at one point were Jesse and Kurt, so the session sounded like Wayne's World, taping as they ran through their unusual Jimmy Page imitations. Chris and Jesse switched guitars for a while, and left-handed Kurt just struck with his own, and they just did play a few of Kurt's original songs and the three of the guitar assault. Once Kurt moved in with the Reeds, he made several short attempts to return to school at Weatherwax, and he was already so behind in his classes he was inevitable that he wouldn't graduate with his class. Kurt told his friends that he might pretend to be retarded to get a special ed classes, and Jesse would tease Kurt and call him slow brain because his poor grades. His only real participation in school was art class, and the one place he didn't feel incompetent. He entered the class projects in 1985 Regional High School Art Show, and his work was put into the permanent collection of the Superintendent's Public Instruction. Mr. Hunter told Kurt that if he applied, he might be able to get a scholarship to an art school. A scholarship in a college would have been required graduating from Weatherwax, something that Kurt didn't see as a possibility unless he was able to hold an extra year. Later in his life, he claimed falsely to have been offered several scholarships. Eventually, Kurt dropped out completely, not before enrolling in Aberdeen's alternative continuation high school. The curriculum was similar to Weatherwax, but there were no formal classes, and students worked with teachers one-on-one basis. Mike Potreas tutored Kurt for a week, and the boy didn't stick long enough to complete the orientation. 2 weeks later, Kurt dropped out of school for dropouts. Once Kurt stopped going to school altogether, Dave Reed found him a job at the Lamplight restaurant in Grayland. It paid $4.25 an hour, and he worked there as a dishwasher, a prep assistant, relief cook, and a busboy. It was the winter season and the restaurant was usually deserted, which suited Kurt fine. It was through the exposure to Dave Reed, along with his Uncle Chuck and Aunt Marie, that Kurt first began to imagine one day that he might have a future in the music business. Dave and Chuck had recorded a single with the Beachcombers in their early days, and the Purple Peanuts backed with the Wheelie, and it was the prized possession in the Reeds' home. Kurt and Jesse played the record constantly, mimicking it on the guitars. Kurt himself was writing songs faithfully. He had several peaches stuffed with the sheets of lyrics. Some of these titles were Wattages in the Cottage, Samurai Sabotage, and the tune that Mr. Reed recalled, Diamond Dave. Kurt even wrote a song mocking a fellow Aberdeen classmate who had committed suicide. The boy's name was Bo, and the song he called Ode to Bo was a song in the country western style. A former member of the Beachcombers had gone on to become the Capitol Records promotion person in Seattle, and the instant that Kurt found out the fact, he clung onto it for dear life, and he was bound to Dave to introduce him, not knowing at the time that the promotion of the person was out in the talent scout. He was always wanted to meet him and thought that he would be to catapult his career, recalled Jesse. This was the nascent beginning of Kurt Cobain and the professional musician, the constant pleading for his introduction, which never came, is evidence that at 17 he was imagining a career in music, and if Kurt admitted his major label ambitions around the Melvins rehearsal shack, he would have treated as a heretic. He had kept his ambition to himself, but he never stopped looking to the move beyond his circumstances. Life with the Reeds was a close in recreating the family that he had lost in the divorce, and the Reeds dinnered together, attended a church group, as the boys and the musical talents encouraged a real affection of love that was obvious and tangible among the members of the household. Kurt included. When he turned 18 in February of 1985, the Reeds held a birthday celebration for him. His Aunt Marie sent him 2 books. The Hammer of the Gods, the Led Zeppelin biography, and a collection of the Norman Rockwell illustrations. In a thank you note, Kurt wrote his aunt, and he described his birthday party. All the kids from the church youth group came over, brought cake for me and Jesse, and then we played stupid games, and Pastor Lloyd sang some songs, and he looks exactly like Mr. Rogers. But it was nice to know that people care about you. And yet, even with the church group, Pastor Lloyd and the surrogate family and the Reeds, Kurt could not psychologically escape from the abandonment he felt from his own fractured family of an origin. He had been hard on himself, and Dave Reed observed. Though Kurt had little contact with his mother, Dave Reed would update Wendy monthly. In August of 1984, she had married Pat O'Connor, and by the next spring she was pregnant, and during her pregnancy she stopped by the house once, and when Wendy saw how lost he looked, she broke down crying, and Kurt got down on his knees and embraced his mother and told her he was fine. And he was, at least for the moment, but then a crisis returned. In March 1985, Kurt cut his finger washing dishes at work and quit in a fit of panic. He had to get stitches, remembered Jesse, and he told me that if he lost a finger and couldn't play guitar, he'd kill himself. With no job and an injury that kept him from playing guitar, Kurt hibernated in the house. He convinced Jesse to skip school, and the two of them spent all day drinking or doing drugs. He withdrew more and more, remembered Ethel Reed. We tried to draw Kurt out, but we just couldn't. As time progressed, we decided that we weren't helping him, and that all we were doing was providing a place for him to withdraw further and further from people. And Kurt's disassociation came to a head in April when he forgot his key one afternoon and kicked in a window to get in. That was the last straw for the Reeds, and they told Kurt that he had to find another place to live. It was rainy April that year in Grays Harbor, and while most of the kids his age were concerned with going to the prom or preparing for graduation, Kurt was once again looking for shelter. Back on the streets, Kurt resumed an endless cycle of crashing in a friend's garage or sleeping in hallways, and desperate to find a turn in the mercy of the government, and began receiving $40 a month in food stamps. And though the local unemployment office, he found a job working at the YMCA beginning May 1st. It was a part-time and administered by the local youth work grant. He wanted to describe this brief employment as his favorite job that was glorified as a janitorial position, but if other employees were sick, he would have to substitute as a lifeguard or activity instructor. Kurt loved the work, particularly working with the kids. Though Kurt was particularly strong swimmer himself, he enjoyed filling in as a lifeguard. Kevin Schillinger, who lived a block away at the YMCA, observed Kurt teaching a 5-year-old and 6-year-olds how to play t-ball, and during the entire lesson he had a huge smile on his face. And working with children, he could find his self-esteem that he lacked, and in other areas of his life he was good with them, and they were non-judgmental. He also took on a second part-time job, and though he rarely discussed its position as a janitor at Weatherwax High School, each evening he would don a brown jumpsuit, push a mop through the hallways at the school that had dropped out of, and though the school was almost over by the time he had begun, the contrast between his peers in preparing for college and for the particular time left him feeling diminished, as if he did it in his life. He lasted 2 months before quitting. Once Kurt left the Reeds' household, Jesse followed, and for a while the pair stayed at Jesse's grandparents' house in Aberdeen. Then on June 1st, 1985, they moved into an apartment at 404 North Michigan Street, and by the standards of this tiny $100 a month studio, the walls of which were painted with pink and thus earned it the name the Pink Apartment, was a dump, but their dump, and the apartment, with the modest furnishings which they had supplemented from lawn ornaments and big-wheeled tricycles, and the backyard recliners stolen from the neighborhood. A picture window faced the street, and Kurt took to this public to be his easel, writing 666 and Satan rules on the glass with soap. A blow doll hung from the noose, covered in a shaving gel. Ed's shaving gel was everywhere in the apartment. Samples had been given from the neighborhood, and Kurt and Jesse discovered that they could suck the fumes from the cans to get high. One night, while they had taken a couple of hits of acid, when a Grays Harbor County sheriff knocked on the door and told them to remove the doll. Luckily, the officer didn't enter the apartment. He would have observed 3 weeks of dishes stacked in the sink, numerous pieces of stolen lawn furniture, Ed's shaving gel whipped all over the walls, and the booty of their latest prank, stealing crosses from headstones at the graveyard and painting them with polka dots. This would not be Kurt's only run-in with the law during this summer of 1985. Kurt and Jesse and their buddies would wait like werewolves for the nightfall and then go forth to terrorize the neighborhood by stealing lawn furniture or spray painting buildings. Though Kurt would later claim his graffiti messages were political, God is gay, abort Christ, he listed a few slogans. In fact, most of what he wrote was nonsensical, and he was enraged by a neighbor with a boat by painting Bodak in red letters on the ship's hull. On the other side, he lettered the boat people go home. One night he painted graffiti on the walls of the YMCA, a small stroke of poetic justice. The next day he was assigned to the job of cleaning it off. On the night of July 23, 1985, Detective Michael Brins was patrolling Mark Street, just a block from the Aberdeen police station, when he observed 3 men and a blonde-haired boy in an alley. The news fled as Ben's car approached, and the blonde kid stood frozen, looking like a deer in the headlights. Ben saw him drop a graffiti marker on the wall just behind him with the poetic statement, "Ain't got no how yo whatchamacallit." Typographically, it wasn't a work of art, as the letters were in a random upper and lower case, and every T was 4 times larger than the rest of the characters. Suddenly the boy bolted and ran 2 blocks before the patrol car caught up with him, and once he did stop, he was handcuffed, and he was given the name Kurt Donald Cobain and was pictured on the politeness as the station. He wrote and signed the statement, which read in full, "Tonight, while standing behind the Seafirst Bank in the alley by the library, talking to 3 other people, I wrote on the Seafirst building, I don't know why I did it. What I put on the wall was, ain't got no how whatchamacallit. Now I see how silly it was for me to have done this, and I'm sorry that I did. When the police car came into the alley, I saw him, and I dropped the red marker that I had used. He was fingerprinted, had mugshots taken, and was released, but required to show up for court for a hearing a few weeks later, and he received a $180 fine, a suspended 30-day sentence, and was warned not to get into any more trouble. For an 18-year-old, Kurt was easier than said done. One night when Jesse was at work, the usual Klingons came over and everyone jammed with their guitars, and one of the neighbors, a large man with a mustache, pounded on the wall and told them to be quiet. And in Kurt's later telling of the story, he said to the neighbor mercilessly beat him for hours. It was one of the many tales that Kurt told in constant abuse at the hands of the Aberdeen rednecks. It was like that, recalled Steve Schillinger. The guy did come over, told him to be quiet, and when Kurt wised off, the fellow punched him a couple of times and told him to shut the fuck up. Jesse wasn't there that night, but in the entire time he knew that Kurt had recalled only one fight. He was usually too busy making people laugh. I was always around to protect him. Jesse was short like Kurt, but he had lifted weights and was heavily built. During the pink apartment period, Jesse probably would have killed for Kurt, a fact Kurt took full advantage of. One day Kurt announced that they were both getting mohawks. They marched down to Steve Schillinger's with the hair clippers and produced, and Jesse soon had a mohawk, and when it came time for Kurt to shave his, he declared it was a dumb idea. And one time Kurt said that he could write something on my forehead, and I could write something on his, remember Jesse, and he took the permanent ink and wrote 666 on mine, and then he took off running. I was always the nitwit who everyone used to experiment on. If there was a chemical or a drink, they'd always want me to try it first, and there was a dark side to Kurt's torment of his best friend. Despite goofing off, Jesse had managed to graduate that spring, and one might say that Jesse was at work at the Burger King, and Kurt ripped the pictures out of Jesse's yearbook, pasted them to the wall, and marked red crosses through them. It was more of a display of his own self-hatred than it was for a reflection of his feelings. For Jesse, perhaps, it was a fit of shame over his rage, and Kurt decided to kick Jesse out of the apartment. And never mind that, Jesse was the one that had to put down the deposit. Soon Jesse was living with his grandmother, and Kurt was on his own, and Kurt had plans to join the Navy anyway, and Kurt felt threatened by this. It was a pattern that he would play his entire life, and rather than lose someone he cared for, he would withdraw first, usually by creating a mock and conflict, and lessening the abandonment he felt was inevitable. Kurt continued to write songs while living in the pink apartment, and though most was still thinly disguised stories of characters and events around him, many were humorous. The summer he wrote a song called Spam about the meat product, and another called The Class of '85, which was an attack on Jesse graduating the class, and he missed it, and he went, "We're all the same, just flies on a turd." Though his songs were about an insular world, even at this stage, Kurt was thinking big. I'm going to make a record, and that's going to be even bigger than U2 or R.E.M. He bragged to Steve Schillinger. Kurt loved both these bands, and he had talked unceasingly about how great the Smithereens were, and though these were the influence that he was careful not to mention around Buzz for the fear of breaking the punk code, and no popular music mattered. He read every fanzine or music magazine he could find, which was in Aberdeen. Wasn't many. He even went and wrote many length of imaginary interviews with himself for non-existent publications, and Kurt and Steve talked about starting their own fanzine and going as far as to draft a sample of the issue. Steve bailed on the project when he realized that Kurt was writing the positive reviews for the records he had never listened to. And Kurt talked about starting his own record label one night, and he and Steve recorded a friend named Scotty Karate doing a spoken word on the monologue. Like so many of his ideas at the time, nothing ever came of it. There wasn't money for a fanzine, publishing, or record labels, and even paying the rent was hard. 2 months after Jesse's departure, Kurt was evicted. His landlord came to the apartment, and when Kurt wasn't home, boxed up all his belongings he had, including his stolen crosses and big wheels, and left them all out on the street. For the third time in 2 years, Kurt was without a home, and once he considered the Navy, Trevor Briggs was signing for the service, and he urged Kurt to take advantage of the Navy's buddy system, where they could placed at boot camp together. Unemployment had gone even higher in Grays Harbor, and the option for an 18-year-old dropout were limited. Kurt went to the Navy recruiting office in the State Street and spent 3 hours talking to the ASVAB vocal aptitude test. He passed, and the Navy was willing to take him, and later Kurt claimed that he received the highest score ever registered on the test, but this could hardly be believed since the test included math. And at the last minute, as he had before, Kurt balked when it came time to join. Most of the nights that Kurt would sleep in the back seat of Greg Hokinson's mother's beat-up Volvo sedan, jokingly called the Volva. By the time October rolled around and the weather turned bad, the nights were miserable in the car seat. Kurt soon found a new benefactor in the Schillinger family, who, after intense lobbying from Kurt, began to take him into a Lamont Schillinger as an English teacher at the Weatherwax. Like Dave Reed, he came for the religious background, and though he'd left Dave Reed, he came back. For the Mormon Church years before, Lamont still attempted to be, as he described it, a freelance, decent human being. There were other similarities to his life at the Reeds and the Schillingers at the ate dinner together, spent time as a family, and their sons were encouraged to play music. Kurt was accepted like family and put into rotation of the chores, in which he did without complaint, and grateful for being included. Room was a bit short in the Schillinger household, and they had 6 kids of their own, and Kurt slept on a sofa in the living room, storing his sleeping bag behind it during the day. He spent Thanksgiving and Christmas morning of 1985 with the Schillingers. Lamont bought Kurt a much-needed pair of Levi's. Later on Christmas Day, Kurt visited Wendy's house, and she had just given birth to his half-sister Brianne. The new baby made the O'Connors' home a lot happier place, and though it was no talk of Kurt moving back in. In December 1985, Kurt began to rehearse some of the songs he had written with Dale Clover on a bass and Greg Hokinson on drums. He called the group Fecal Matter, and it was the first real band he had convinced Clover to accompany him to a trip to his Aunt Marie's to tape. Man, these chapters are longer. Some of the songs he arrived, Marie remembered, with the huge notebook full of lyrics. I showed him how to adjust a few things and how to record with the reel-to-reel, and he went right at it. Kurt recorded with his voice first, and then he and Clover would track the guitar, bass, and the drum part would be over the vocals. Marie was troubled by the lyrics Suicide Samurai, but wrote it off as typical teenage behavior. The boys also cut Bambi Slaughter, the story of how a boy pawned his parents' wedding rings, Buffy's Pregnant, Buffy from the Family Affairs television show, Downer, Laminated Effects Spank Through, and Sound of Dentage. When Kurt got back to Aberdeen, he used the Schillingers' tape deck to dub off copies. Having the actual tape in the hand was tangible proof of him that he had talent, and it was the first physical manifestation of the self-esteem that he had through this music. Nonetheless, Fecal Matter broke up without even ever playing a single gig. Despite his external circumstances, Kurt's inner artistic life was growing in leaps and bounds, and he continued to make movies using the Super 8 camera. Over a short silent film from the period that Kurt was walking through the abandoned buildings wearing the KISW, Seattle's Best Rock t-shirt, trying to look like he's Jean Paul Belmondo in The Breathless, with his wraparound sunglasses. In another, he puts on his Mr. T mask and pretends to snort a huge quantity of what looks like cocaine, a special effect he created with flour and a vacuum cleaner. Without exceptions, these films are inventive, and was with everything Kurt created disturbing. That spring, he attempted to start a business decorating skateboards with graffiti. He went as far to put up flyers around town, and he only ever had one teenager ever hire him, asking for Exploding Head, and Kurt gladly drew this. It was his specialty, but the customer never paid, and the business failed. On May 18th, 1986, which is my daughter's birthday, and my grandmother's death day, Kurt began and fell under the care of the supervision of the Aberdeen Police Department. At 12:30 in the morning, police were called to the abandoned building at 618 West Market, and Officer John Green found Kurt climbing on the roof, seemingly intoxicated. Green remembered Kurt being a nice kid, if a little scared. Kurt was charged with trespassing and being a minor in possession of alcohol by consumption. When the cops found that he had an outstanding warrant for malicious mischief, he had failed to pay for the fine for the graffiti arrest, and plus earlier the alcohol arrest from Seattle, and he couldn't come up with the bail. They put him in jail. The cell he stayed in was straight out of an old gangster movie: iron bars, concrete floor, no ventilation. On his statement, Kurt listed a bad back under the medical conditions and said that he described himself as a 19-year-old, 135 pounds, 5 foot 9 inches, brown hair, blue eyes. He exaggerated in describing both his height and weight. And Kurt used his one phone call to dial Lamont Schillinger to beg him to bail him out. Lamont decided his parenting of the Cobains had gone far enough, and that Kurt would not get out of this jam by himself. Lamont did visit him the next day, and even though it was against Lamont's religion, he bought Kurt a carton of cigarettes. Unable to raise his bail, Kurt stayed 8 days. Several years later, Kurt used the experience to crest folklore that accelerated his wit and adaptability. He alleged that his first jail he drew pornography for the other prisoners to masturbate to. His home-drawn porn was in such a demand that, as he told it, he traded it for cigarettes, and soon he collected all the cigarettes in the jail. At this point, he became the store and went the man who ran the jail. He only dared tell his fictional tale to the people who didn't know him. His Aberdeen friends remembered him for being scared from his images of prison films he had seen over the years and didn't say a single word, so another inmate during this entire stay. Life at the Schillingers was soon to end for Kurt. He had been there for a year, and at 19 he was at the age of emancipation, and he was neither their blood and neither their official foster child. He had also begun to quarrel with Eric Schillinger, who thought that Kurt had overstayed his welcome, and one weekend the Schillinger family was on vacation without Kurt, and Kurt, upon their return, discovered that he had coerced their 2 dogs to defecate on Eric's bed. But even this slight wasn't the final straw. It came the other night in August 1986 when Eric and Kurt got into a fight over a Totino's mini pizza. All reports is that it was the most serious fight Kurt was ever in, and Kurt tried to hit Eric with the 2x4. I saw Eric the next day and remember Kurt and Schillinger, and he had a black eye. I saw Kurt and he had 2 black eyes. Kurt left that night, nursing a swollen face, and retreated to the Melvin's band room the next day. He paid Steve $10 to haul all his remaining stuff down to the Crovers, and his life had been reduced to all that too unfamiliar pattern of intimacy, conflict, and banishment, followed by isolation. One of the only bright spots came when Chris Novoselic seemed interested in forming a band. Chris was one of the first people upon whom Kurt bestowed his fecal matter tape. He had a little demo tape, and it had Spank Through on it, and Chris recalled, "I thought it was a really good song." Shelley Dilly, Kurt's girlfriend, had been friends with Kurt since high school and began to let him crash behind their home, sleeping in Chris' Volkswagen van. I always made sure that he had enough blankets so he didn't freeze to death, and she also gave him free food from whoever came into McDonald's where she worked. In early September 1986, Hillary Rickrod, a librarian at Aberdeen Timberland Library, heard a knock on the door of her home only late one afternoon, and she looked through the keyhole only to see a tall boy with reddish eyes, and Kurt, who she recognized, would frequently spend his afternoons in the library, reading or sleeping, and seeing these 2 motley characters on her doorstep in the town. Burglary and robbery were a part of life, and she felt a twinge of alarm when she opened the door, and her alarm was increased when Kurt reached under his coat. But what he pulled out was a tiny pigeon with a broken wing. "It's hurt and can't fly," Kurt said. Rickrod was momentarily taken back. "You're the bird lady, aren't you?" Kurt inquired, sounding almost annoyed. She was indeed the bird lady, and running the Aberdeen Wild Bird Rescue Organization, but originally people telephoned her with the bird that was injured. No one has ever just shown up to her door before, certainly not with 2 stoned-looking teenagers. Kurt told her that he had found a pigeon under the Yonge Street Bridge, and as they had walked 15 minutes to her house as soon as they saw it. How they knew that she was the bird lady never explained, but they watched intently as she began to care for the animal. Walking, they watched intently walking through the house. They spotted a guitar that belonged to Rick Rod's husband, and Kurt immediately sized it up. It's an old Les Paul. It's a copy, but it's a very early copy. He offered to buy it, and Rick Rod said that it wasn't for sale. She momentarily wondered if they might steal it. Yet their only concern was the care and comfort of the tiny pigeon back in the kitchen. The two men observed while Rick Rod slowly moved the bird's wing to determine how badly it was broken. "He's hurt, isn't he?" Kurt asked. Rick Rod had 2 nighthawks in her kitchen, 2 of the only birds of the species in captivity, and she told them the birds even being featured in a story on the front page of the Aberdeen Daily World. "I'm in the band," Kurt replied. Announcing this fact, she could have been the common knowledge, but even I'll never get the front page of the Daily World. Those birds had me beat by a mile. And that there's the end of chapter 5. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe.